Hello, and welcome to this RiverSec webinar. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and today we're going to be talking about mandatory cyber crisis testing for financial institutions. Joining me today are Miguel Gutierrez, who's an advisory consultant in our New York office and has got 8 years of experience in guiding financial institutions on their path toward meeting regulatory expectations, such as they are. And Richard Suls, who brings nearly 2 decades of experience in cybersecurity. Our US lead in security advisory here at RiverSec operates where the boardroom, crisis room, and courtroom converge, including as a court qualified expert witness in the US federal and state courts since 2007. And Richard also speaks regularly at security conferences. And the topic of today's webinar is our white paper called Mandatory Cyber Crisis and Tabletop Exercises in Financial Services. Rolls right off the tongue, and that white paper is going to be available. It's going to be shared with everybody who's watching us live today, and it's going to be available later for downloads for others. But without further ado, let's dig right into it. Richard, crisis management tabletop exercises used to be just like a good practice. When did they and why did they shift to becoming like a regulatory requirement in both US and EU?
So thanks, Jana. Across both the US and the EU, we're seeing that supervisory authorities now require firms to not just have something on paper, but to actually demonstrate that their incident response, crisis management, and operational resilience capacities actually work in practice. So written plans are not sufficient to meet regulators' needs. And we've seen that regulators expect actual evidence of structured testing, participation by senior management, and documented improvement along the way.
Okay. Miguel, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think this motivation has two sides. So, on the one end, attacks are growing more and more sophisticated, which makes it all the more important for your security and incident response team to practice this proper identification of incidents and prompt escalation. And on top of that, large organizations have more and more legal obligations. And I'm thinking of not only is there greater connectivity between organizations and the prevalence of shared services that increase the potential for the impact of an incident on anyone to spread to others, but just so many overlapping regulations and notification requirements that organizations should practice before something happens and the pressure's on.
Yeah, I mean, our white paper talks about how sort of just having plans is no longer enough, and regulators want actual evidence of structured testing and sort of senior leadership participation. What's driving that change, Miguel?
Right. So I think we see this pattern in regulation and in other industry standards. I'm thinking of the SWIFT customer security program, where new controls are introduced as recommendations or maybe a little more broadly defined at first, and then future iterations become more and more prescriptive. And in this specific case, I see another pair of main driving factors. And so the first here is the need to test response plans that include personnel outside of your IT department. And that's going to require greater organizational, broadly, cooperation and blessing from senior leadership. So while a written plan that fulfills the requirements is great, actually performing a test and producing that evidence is going to require more than your CISO. And regulators want to see that your organization has thought about this. Secondly, there's been a growing shift in the responsibility for cybersecurity incidents going towards the C-suite, and I'm talking about criminal penalties. And that just makes it all the more important to include them in these exercises. I'm thinking of 2023, the former Uber CSO ended up being probation. And the SolarWinds case last year, which ended up being dropped, but still not a very fun position for any C-suite to be in.
No, certainly not. So maybe that's something we want to talk about a little bit is sort of we're talking about leadership, right? But you're also talking about IR teams and technical people. What sort of a level of exercises are these that we're talking about, Richard?
Sure. So it depends on the regulatory body to which the organization or the regulations to which the organizations are beholden. But ultimately, what we're seeing is that it needs to happen from the top to the bottom, and that is effectively saying that we've tested the technical responsibility of the teams, but also that the C-suite is completely aware and in many cases signs off on these either improvements or these exercises that are run. It's basically a lot of these regulations are saying, as Miguel mentioned a moment ago, that there is a necessary buy-in from leadership and that they have to be either involved or sign off or be aware at the very least.
Anything you want to add, Miguel?
No, I think Richard's covered that.
Okay. So, I mean, that's just something that a lot of people come to me. They're talking about sort of, what's the correct level to practice these things. But as you said, like today, we're heavily focusing on the leadership level exercises. Now, Richard, I think in the EU, DORA is probably the clearest and most sort of explicit mandate for cyber exercising. What would you say are the most important elements of DORA that leaders need to know today?
Sure. So in a nutshell, DORA requires financial entities to establish a digital operational resilience testing program. And that includes regular testing of ICT systems, supporting critical functions, at least annual testing, although more frequent testing is viewed as better by regulators. Inclusion of scenario-based testing as a formal method. So the exercises that we're talking about, scenarios that are specifically customized to the organization. And lastly, governance accountability at that management body level.
Okay. Anything you want to add, Miguel?
One point I do want to highlight here is the scope of the regulation. So while it is an EU regulation, and that's going to pretty clearly apply to any branches your institution has in the EU, it also applies to any third-party ICT, so information and communications technology providers, that provides services to EU entities. So even if your business is in the US, if you're providing services in the EU, or to organizations in the EU, thinking data centers, cloud and IT service providers, etc., you will still be subject to these same regulations.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and speaking of EU regulation, Richard, it's my understanding that, for example, the New York DFS does not explicitly mandate tabletop exercises. Is that true?
So that's true that New York DFS doesn't actually say tabletop exercises. However, in our experience, examiners routinely expect to see evidence that plans are tested, that exercises, and ultimately tabletop exercises are the dominant method today that firms use to demonstrate that they've tested these plans or that they've used these plans in a simulation. So we've seen enforcement actions repeatedly emphasizing failures in GRC preparedness, so governance and response preparedness and executive oversight following incidents. And what they're trying to do ultimately is signal that just having a written plan is not sufficient.
Yeah, I mean, Miguel, it seems to me like even when sort of tabletop exercises aren't specifically mentioned, regulators in the US seem to expect or certainly value them. Why do you think that is? Why is tabletop testing emerging as like the default evidence during these examinations?
So I think of tabletop testing, the term, as an emerging, if not already established term within the industry. I just think that regulators tend to move a little more cautiously when adopting new terms. And so what I see is that we're usually given a definition first or a list of requirements that basically add up to a tabletop exercise. And then we see that term tabletop come in later as a recommendation instead of a requirement. So I'm thinking of, for example, like in the NYDFS Part 500 regulation, we have requirements for annual testing of incident response plans, BCDR, regular updates as necessary. And that's all fine and good. But if we take a look at the FFIEC IT examination handbook, which is a broad handbook that is reviewed by federal financial institution examiners, we see that, again, we're given a list of what a tabletop exercise basically is, and then explicitly told a tabletop exercise, those words, is going to generally fulfill these requirements. And so you
Yeah.
have regulators that are trained to sort of recognize this as fulfilling the requirements listed beforehand. And similarly, this is also done in, I believe, yes, PCI DSS version 4.
So I do want to get back to the PCI DSS, but first, Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just, I guess, add that for New York DFS, they don't actually need to mandate the word tabletop, like Miguel is saying. Effectively, they put all the pieces together around it to say, we need this, and tabletops are going to be the most effective way for you to prove this.
Yeah, I guess is that true? Like, why is this the best way to demonstrate that sort of your that you are exercising? Like, what makes tabletop exercises so great is maybe what I'm asking.
Sure. So, having conducted many, many tabletops and customized many tabletops, I can tell you that most teams, no matter how prepared they feel going into it, almost always walk out with lessons learned, right? So exercising these things is so important. And quite frankly, in cybersecurity, we are very busy overall. So cybersecurity teams are very busy. There's not a lot of extra time to do these things, but when the time is carved out to do them, they become very rewarding and they become very telling about the gaps that the teams can uncover. So
Okay.
ultimately, it's like driving a car. All right. When you first got in a car for the very first time, you had to look around, you had to press on the clutch if it was a manual transmission, you have to feather the clutch and press on the gas ever so slightly just to get everything in gear and go. You got to look out for other drivers. That's a first time experience. But for anybody who got in a car today or recently and drove, who's done it many, many, many times, you just get in, you turn the key, you do what your muscle memory tells you to do, you watch out for other drivers, and you go. And
Yeah.
that's what we're
Okay.
trying to do for people, is give them that experience where they aren't afraid of the incident, they're just empowered to deal with it because they've got that muscle memory, having rehearsed it over and over again.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So, before I get back to the PCI DSS you mentioned, Miguel, I just want to remind our audience that there will be time for audience questions later. So we already have a good number of questions, but keep them coming in. We'll have some time to go through your questions, and obviously we want to talk about the things that sort of you're interested in. But now, Miguel, with the PCI DSS, now that requires annual testing, and I'm sure QSAs love to see evidence of tabletop exercises. What does that mean for CISOs and CIOs? How do you frame this requirement to your board if you're PCI DSS compliant?
So thankfully, the rise of these exercises being more or less prescribed within regulation makes the job a little easier. But I think what's most important to highlight here is that while these changes can be performed and usually are like designed and mostly organized within IT or IT security, that what we need here to be compliant is this cross-organizational collaboration that's going to require help from maybe not the board, but from senior management and from a level above and across the C-suite.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So let's get back to the white paper a little bit, Richard. I think the white paper highlights three major failure patterns: uh, treating tabletop exercises as training, having only IT involved, and failing to document outcomes. Which of these do you think is sort of most common? Like, what do you see the most out there?
So what I see the most is actually the first one, which is treating tabletop exercises as a training.
Hmm.
That's mainly because they're not done frequently enough, because most of the teams that I work with, when they come to the table, this is the first time they've done it in a year, maybe ever. And so it becomes more of a training exercise because they're not familiar with the documents, they're not familiar with the decision-making tree. Everything is kind of new to them. Again, this deals with cybersecurity not necessarily having enough time or funding to tackle everything that's necessary in most organizations.
Is there an exercise, how you exercise type, are people just out of practice with how to run an exercise like this? Is there that component in this as well? Like, how do I, because it's role play, it's a game, like how do I approach that? Is that an element of it?
Yeah, a lot of people tend to, in these exercises, tend to take two different polarizing views. They typically come into the exercise as, this is a game, it's not that important, I'm here because I'm supposed to be here. And then 15 to 30 minutes into it, they become bought into the exercise, and you can see they're starting to sweat a little bit, and they're starting to feel like this is real. And so you're never really getting the middle ground where they remember, like, this could be real, but right now it's a safe space. You're either getting, why am I here? Or, oh my God, my hair is on fire.
Exactly. Is that your experience as well, Miguel?
Yes, I agree with Richard. And I think there's a piece that I think connects organizations or teams viewing this as training and also having only IT involved, because I think that it kind of increases this feeling of it being siloed and an exercise that's like within the confines of this wall or this floor. And I think there's also this root cause of a failure of getting buy-in from senior leadership and expanding the scope outside of IT.
Yeah, okay. So, continuing with you, Miguel, what do you think is the most sort of surprising gap you see between sort of what the leadership thinks that the organization can do in a cyber crisis versus what actually ends up happening under pressure?
What I see that's the most surprising is at the start, there tends to be this, especially with teams that aren't rehearsed, there tends to be this hesitation to escalate or otherwise take the necessary action. And this is like when the analysis of an incident has just begun and there's very limited information about the incident, and that's even if the SIRT is ready to make that call, to call it an incident, to escalate it, and to start putting the plan into motion. And that's where I see the greatest value in this. Like rehearsing the plan makes it so that it's second nature, and I think Richard brought up the term muscle memory, so that there's no hesitation, and the team feels empowered to do what they have to do and to raise the alarms when they need to.
Does that match what you're seeing, Richard?
Absolutely. I think that one thing that Miguel didn't mention that I also see is that there's a perceived bottleneck on decision making. So the team does a great job, but then a decision to take down an assembly line must be made, or not to take down an assembly line if there's an incident. And that's where only a few people are empowered to make that decision by the business, and they've probably never had to make that decision before in a real world environment. And so that becomes a bottleneck for the exercise, and certainly a point of, if we take down this assembly line and we lose several millions of dollars because of an incident, who's responsible for the downside of that? And being able to practice through that and confirm that that was a step that was taken appropriately can give those folks a lot more reassurance that they're doing the right thing in a true incident.
That's interesting, because I was wondering, Miguel, when you mentioned that sort of hesitation to escalate, I was wondering if it's because, like, in a real situation, you never know. Like when you see something that looks small, you don't know if it's going to blow up into a big thing or not. But like during an exercise, even when you start small, like you're in this room for 3 hours, like this is probably going to be something. So I wonder if that sort of that game element, Richard, you were saying that's a part of the early moments of the exercise. I wonder if that's part of it. What do you guys think?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think what I've seen is, I think perhaps in real world incidents or at the very start, the pressure is on the analyst. But in this game, we see this pressure being put more on management, on higher levels, people more higher up in the hierarchy where this decision isn't made as often. And so I think there's where we get some greater value
Okay.
in practicing these decisions higher up the chain.
Do you want to add something, Richard?
I think Miguel's spot on. It's very easy for a technical team to sit around at the lunch counter, and at the water cooler and discuss like what could go wrong and how will we fix it. But once you get from that team and you start to have to make decisions that can affect the company, that could be a bad decision. It could cause, more loss than not making the decision. That's where people start to get squeamish, especially again if they've never rehearsed this or they don't understand what the outcome of the decision tree might be at that time.
So you're talking about like a higher level of decisions, Richard, and I want to continue on that. Regulators certainly want sort of executive senior management participation in these exercises. How should the C-suite, for example, CEOs and CIOs and COOs, how should they be involved in the exercise for the exercise to be sort of considered credible?
So my favorite way to do that, to meet the mandates of these regulatory frameworks, is to have a technical tabletop that feeds into a crisis management exercise. So they're two discrete exercises that are very much linked to each other. During the technical tabletop, you typically would have some senior folks there. You would have your CISO or chief information officer or somebody at that level available and aware that we're running a technical tabletop. And then in a really well-designed scenario, some of those outcomes will feed into the crisis management exercise, where we would then turn around a week later, hold a crisis management exercise with senior leadership and say, this is what we went through in the technical tabletop. At a high level, here is what happened. How would you respond to this, this, and this? And so by doing both of those, we're really meeting the spirit of the framework's directions and making sure that we're kind of covering all the bases in what a regulator expects to see.
So that's, do you like that way of sort of that order of doing them? First the technical and then the management one.
Yes, because the technical folks and the management folks typically have very different ways of working with tabletops or responding to tabletops. The technical folks really like to dig into the meat of what's going on within their systems, which is fantastic from a technical perspective. It shows that they understand from 0 to 100, what's going on within their domains. But the C-suite doesn't want to know all of that stuff. They don't need to, and it's quite frankly a waste of their time to talk at a very technical level. They need to know the high level stuff, the stuff that in a real incident is going to make it to them, right? If your domain controllers suddenly fall down, that's not something you need to tell the C-suite necessarily. They need to know that we're unable to authenticate users logging in across the entire network because of a failure on the server level. But again, there's just this difference between like a very technical explanation and ways of fixing the problem and the crisis management or the C-suite one. The C-suite, just to kind of wrap it up, the C-suite is more interested in their stakeholders. They're more interested in the organization's reputation. They're interested in making sure that the technology stack doesn't fall down, but they don't need to know every bit of the technology stack. And I think that's really what separates the two. They have responsibilities that the technical folks would never dream of, because if a technical folk was a person, even a lead senior technical person was contacted by a journalist, their responsibility is to forward that to marketing or to communications. They're not meant to answer. But if a journalist contacts someone in the C-suite, different story, right?
Sure. All right. Okay, Miguel, let me ask you this. There's a specific sentence in the DORA regulation. I think it's governance accountability at the management body level. What does that look like in practice?
I think this is one of those snippets, one of those quotes that's really there to support implementing a proper tabletop exercise. Something that we've talked about before, maybe 5-10 minutes ago, is that these exercises need to be cross-departmental. They need senior management buy-in and participation. And that's going to need support from management, from outside of IT. For examples beyond just like including management in the room or in these exercises, there's the sanctioning of these tests. And after the test, like reporting lessons learned to management and making sure they're accountable for implementation of any remediation actions that come up. So a lot of that isn't going to be technical remediation. A lot of that is going to be policy revision, and that's going to require their sign off.
Okay. Richard, I have a question for you about sort of these regulators sort of requirements. Our white paper talks about how regulators focus on substance over form. What is that? What are the key elements that they want to see that would make an exercise credible to them and sort of audit ready?
So typically when we say substance over form, what we're basically saying is that the regulators aren't looking for a bunch of paperwork that says that we can do this. What it's saying is the regulators are looking to see the example of the exercises where a team may have fallen over a little bit, but then they have lessons learned at the end with a like a timeline to go forward, and then you can actually show an examiner, we've remediated everything that we found to be a problem that we were able to remediate in the first 3 to 6 months, for instance.
Okay.
That's where you're proving that not only did you have a paper plan, but you tested it and you learned from the testing, you've improved, and you're kind of on this wheel, so to speak, of testing, improving, and then back to the test again, essentially, and then back to the improvement. And regulators understand that it takes time to improve things, that processes, procedures can't just change overnight. They're looking for organizations to show that is mapped out, not that they found a problem and fixed it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Miguel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say that besides regulators doing this to give you more homework, it's also just important to recognize these exercises as a good opportunity to find out more about your organization.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't mean that you're always going to get straight A's on everything. And that's good because that tells you where you can budget in the future and where you can dedicate some more time to securing your organization.
No, I like that. That's like the old conversation we always have around sort of just application pen testing or whatever, where people are like they want a clear bill of health, like nothing, no problems, nothing found. And I'm like, that's not how you talk about security. Like talking about security is like we found these problems, here's how we addressed them, and then we verified that they were fixed, and then now we're better off for it.
Yep.
Same thing here. Okay. So so Miguel, let's talk about how do you design realistic financial sector threat scenarios that sort of go beyond the basic ransomware situation, and how do you test that operational resilience?
Right. So I think broadly, it's important to include scenarios that have been, that are grounded based on past incidents, recent incidents, and take advantage of like overlapping regulations and regulatory bodies, especially like the most visible example here is reporting requirements. But I also want to highlight something that Richard brought up not too long ago, which is, for example, like a reporter contacting IT, or maybe an incident coming into the organization from a report that made it to the communications department first. I think something that kind of emphasizes communication between departments, because I think that's some of the greatest value for these kinds of exercises, because I don't think that's something that happens terribly often, except when it needs to in an incident.
Okay, Richard, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So at first, I just want to say that when we're talking specifically about financial sector, I think scenarios and Miguel's spot on. You want to use things that have been an issue to the organization before. At a higher level, I think we can talk about how you might want to address threats that impact trading continuity or market integrity, client access to funds or data. If you're a securities or capital market firm, a regulator might focus on those things specifically. But I also want to kind of call back something that Miguel mentioned a moment ago, and that is, or you kind of touched upon, and that is that frequently I like to, when we work with clients, I like to talk to my point of contact or points of contact and say, not only are we testing your plans, but we know that you're probably aware of some of your weak points. Tell us about them so that we can help you show them to your senior management through these exercises. And then you can go to bat for the money that you need to remediate these. So there's that level of, we can use these exercises to prove a problem that you've been calling out, but don't have a third party, such as ourselves, saying this is a problem, where that can be immensely valuable for budget reasons.
So maybe it's around that I want to sort of ask you, like, we've been talking about sort of what sort of things are involved in these scenarios, but like, how do you bring the heat? Like, how do you bring the pressure to these people? Like, how do you pressure them in that situation?
Honestly, it's not terribly difficult typically. I think that, especially from a technical, well, it depends. So from a technical perspective, most teams are aware to some degree of the shortfallings of their infrastructure or of their systems. And they know if you're leaning on something that could be a hot button issue, because they're already aware of it. And so that creates a lot of pressure internally already. Even if they're not making you aware of that, you can, as a facilitator, start to see them taking things more and more seriously as the scenarios unfold, because these are customized to really hit home for these teams. Now, from a board level, a crisis management level, it's even more easy, to be perfectly honest, because C-suite, the board, they should and typically are always concerned with things like organizational reputation. They're typically, if not always, concerned with their stakeholders. For a financial institution, that might be the people that are depositing money into your institution, right? If the reputation of the organization gets trashed by a ransomware attack or a bunch of PII spill, that, even in a simulation, that really makes the hair of the C-suite stand up on the back of their neck, typically.
Yeah.
And one example. Oh, sorry.
No.
One quick.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, one quick example is at this here we did a crisis management exercise for a country's monetary authority. Think of the Federal Reserve in the U.S., but it wasn't the Federal Reserve. And they were taking it very seriously because their country relies on this monetary authority's robustness, like so many countries. And so if that monetary authority was seen by outsiders as being vulnerable or unable to control their infrastructure, then they could lose a large amount of investment, and that would be catastrophic for them. So you could see very quickly that they were taking it seriously and that they had a huge realistic concern about their visibility. We've done same thing for museums, where if the museum is considered to not be safe, then you're not going to get visitors to the museum, and that was a huge concern for the stakeholders at the museum during that exercise.
All right. So that was an interesting anecdote, but I think you were only telling it to me to distract me. You could tell I was triggered when you were talking about reputation risk, because I don't believe that that's a real thing. Like, do you ever, like, are these conversations that you have with the, like, I don't know, I want to push back on reputation risk. I don't think it's a real thing.
It absolutely is for some organizations. Let's just, again, think about a financial organization. If your reputation is tanked because of a breach, you may not have investors, or if you're a true bank, you may not have people bringing money to put into your organization, because they're worried about the organization falling down, or they're worried about a hack taking out everybody's money. That's fairly unrealistic at this point, that latter one.
Yeah.
But for the purpose of an extreme, example, I think it holds. And
No, I guess like in a financial institution, you could have like a bank run, like everybody comes in and like I don't know, wants their savings out of it or something. But like I'm always disheartened by this because like I remember the Ashley Madison hack from way back when like all their information got leaked, but people kept on using the service anyway because they like cheating more than they like privacy, and like as one company told me that they had a breach. They had people come in and sort of change their passwords, and their ad reviews went up, like because everybody was logging on to a website, so they made a bunch of money that day. And I'm like, that is the wrong lesson to learn from here. This.
Agreed, but that was probably not a financial institution. First of
No,
all, Ashley
no, okay.
Madison is not a financial institution. Um, but an example I would use would be for reputation purposes is Arthur Anderson.
Mm,
They were the ones that were effectively taken down by the Enron scandal, and it was
true.
purely reputational that took them down.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. You've convinced me a little bit. With that, if you guys have the audience members, if you have any questions to our experts about whether reputation risks are real or anything else, just please keep posting those while we go on. But I do want to still talk to you guys about sort of Richard. A lot of companies are seeing a fairly high turnover in personnel lately, and that makes consistency a little bit difficult. How does an organization ensure continuity in crisis readiness as roles are changed frequently?
Great question. So basically, the way to do that is the way that we build continuity in a lot of other parts of organizations, and that is to build a robust program rather than relying on an individual or in some cases just an annual event, like we do this test once a year and that's it. So by having this program, first of all, you're meeting the regulator expectations. You may still be doing one annual test, but you're mapping out the findings of that test from that moment through the next test, which could be a full 12 months, and saying, look, we found these gaps. We're going to try and remediate them in the first quarter. We found these gaps. They're really more of like the next 3 to 6 months remediation. And then we've got these much bigger concerns, but they're bigger concerns that are harder to fix. So we're going to have to drop them into the 6 to 12 month timetable. And by keeping actual documentation about that and preparing for the next exercise, keeping documentation about what's been remediated, even if someone leaves halfway through the year, that program is going to be robust enough, again, that if it's documented, someone can pick it up and move forward with it.
Okay. Miguel, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yep, that's huge. Documentation is so important. And I just like to repeat a quote from one of our consultants here, which is, if it's not written down, it does not exist. If someone who knows what to do leaves or is promoted or changes departments, they take that information with them and poof, your work's gone. So making sure everything is documented, making sure this documentation is updated regularly, which honestly happens best when you perform these kinds of exercises to see how it works for your organization today.
Is there also something, Miguel, in what Richard was saying, sort of having like these different timelines? For example, are there advantages when you're building like a year-round cyber crisis exercise program of like multiple events rather than just one annual event?
Yeah, I think of this, it's has its differences with, say, like, I'll just say like a penetration test, a security assessment.
Hmm.
But I think there is some significant overlap, and I think there's a clever way to roll this into a vulnerability management program. Like Richard was saying, there's different kinds of findings or lessons learned from this exercise that are going to have different remediation timelines or, SLAs from a vulnerability. And so it's going to be a little different, right? Because we're not talking about patching or firewall changes, but rather changes to documentation. But it's a very similar strategy that you can take, and that I think many IT security teams are already familiar with.
Okay. Richard, do you want to add to that?
No, I think Miguel said it very well. I don't have anything to add to that one.
Okay,
Sorry.
but you're in favor of sort of multiple exercises throughout the year as well, and not just one big annual one.
Yeah, absolutely. The more, at least at first, the more rehearsal that can be done, the more confident teams are. And I
Yeah.
guess I would add to say that the success you see on these people's faces now, it's mixed with a little bit of fear typically, because they start to feel like the scenarios are real and people are sweating throughout these exercises. But at the end, you truly see that people have come together and learned who they can rely on within their team, where the knowledge sits. It has value beyond simply just testing the incident response plan on paper. It brings teams together.
Do you often see sort of surprises in that? In like, I would assume that like when you start an exercise like this and you pitch the scenario, everybody turns to, I don't know, the CISO or the most senior person in the room, like, what do we do? Like, does that happen, or do like some people sort of rise up sort of beyond their role?
Yeah, so I see that all the time. And in fact, frequently what we do is we ask the CISO or the CIO to be available but not be in the room. We've had tabletops where they were invited and they could not keep their mouths shut. All due respect to CISOs and CIOs, but they get to positions of power by being strong personalities
Sure.
typically, and so they can take over the room very easily. And people who are technically under them in the organizational tree will typically defer to them.
Mm.
So it can be detrimental to have a CISO in a technical tabletop, but it's absolutely important that they be available for it, because they may need to make a decision at various points in it.
Okay. So let me ask you this. When we're talking about institutions with thousands of employees and distributed decision making, how do you make an exercise relevant, sort of, and aligned across those multiple business units?
I think
Go
a
ahead,
lot of
Miguel.
this work starts even before an exercise is conducted, and that's in this design, surveying an organization, and not just IT, for like what are the pain points, the greatest fears, what keeps not just IT but compliance up at night. Because again, we're talking a lot about CISOs and how this exercise is conducted within IT security, but I think the really important part to rehearse here is the connections across the organization. So that also means that we have to look at priorities that are outside of IT, but that will also impact the department itself.
Okay.
Keep it relevant for a broader audience.
Yeah. Okay. So, Richard, do you think that regulators are going to be also moving in this direction towards sort of more frequent or even continuous scenario testing?
I don't think that regulations are going to move in that direction anytime soon. I think that once a year or annual testing is going to be considered enough. But if you want to show a regulator that you're using belt and suspenders, for
Mm.
instance, or that you're really serious about these programs, for instance, if you've been given a fine before because you didn't meet a regulation, or if you have had an incident and you want to show regulators that you're on top of it and you're trying to make good on what you've learned from that, yeah, absolutely. Having even twice a year exercises goes a long way to showing that you're invested in this and in uplifting the incident response.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, it is, I think, a law at this point that you can't have a webinar without mentioning AI, and we haven't sort of touched upon that too much in this one. So, Miguel, let me sort of unleash you here with how do you think sort of AI powered attacks will influence crisis exercise design over the next 2 or 3 years, for example?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with attackers using AI.
Mm.
And so what we've seen is some pretty nimble, I'll say broadly, social engineering. So quickly drafted and very responsive phishing attacks, vishing, and where you can impersonate someone using AI. Enough C-suite or leaders in your organization have probably given webinars to give a model enough training data to impersonate someone. And I'll go ahead and have 2 fingers here, so I'm the real deal. And so these nimble attackers have to be met with even quicker response by your teams. On the other side, though, we have a lot of organizations implementing AI tools, AI agents very quickly and without proper controls or any testing at all. And this is only going to give attackers another vector. And so even once you have experienced an attack, especially with AI, it can be tricky to perform a root cause analysis and to really have a confident remediation for this.
Yeah. Richard, what sort of AI shenanigans do you have up your sleeve?
Yeah, I think Miguel kind of covered most of it very well. The speed compression that AI causes when it comes to attacks and assistance with phishing, reconnaissance, lateral movement, it's all much faster now. Social engineering, as you mentioned, Miguel, is much more easily accomplished because of AI. I think additionally, what AI can do is overwhelm analysts because it's much more easily used to flood systems with noise, and that can be a real problem. It's also easier these days for AI. It's lowered the bar for sophisticated supply chain compromises. So as I'm developing exercises these days, I keep in mind, I think we all kind of, for the last couple of years, since the supply chain attack that we are probably all remember a couple of years ago on pagers, I think we've all kind of got this supply chain awareness in the back of our minds. It's definitely relevant. It's not going away anytime soon, and I think AI kind of bolsters that. And last but not least, AI can adapt to behavior in some cases. So it's not just like a scripted malware or ransomware. An AI augmented attack can kind of respond to your defender's actions. So when I develop a static inject in a tabletop, which is what we used to do a lot, that doesn't really capture that. So these injects need to be a little more dynamic when it comes to facilitating exercises where AI may be involved. And you have to be aware that the scenario can evolve based on how the team reacts, because that's truly happening in the real world at this point.
Yeah, but how about we flip that table and sort of bring AI to our side? Like we arm this large language model with our incident, because the problem with incident response policies is that those are static documents and they never sort of match what's happening in real world. But maybe if you train your LLM on, or like a machine learning model on, your first principles of incident response, and sort of feed it your policies and things like that, and then let that make you all the decisions that have to be made. Like, are we going to see that?
I think you just came up with a brand new product for us.
Jesus, I hope not. It's supposed to be a joke. Incident response expert system. God, what a world.
It
All
may
right.
exist. As far as I'm aware, I've not seen it yet, but it would not be surprising, and you could certainly host that LLM, which has ingested all of your procedures and policies, on an offline device.
Yeah.
Because you certainly wouldn't want that as part of your network when an attacker is in there, because then they
now it's
could
ransomware too.
As fun as that sounds, it does. As fun as that sounds, and as fun as updating documentation can be, it also does kind of sidestep the question or the problems that we're trying to address with these exercises, and that's the human decision making, the responsibility, and the accountability.
Yeah, the actual skills. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah, and I'm not sure we're at the point where we want to outsource corporate decision making to expert systems yet. All right, let's move on to the audience questions now, and we have some good ones. How do I convince my C-suite to spend time on practicing this incident response, or doing these cyber exercises?
Well, the good news for that is that you don't really have to convince the C-suite. That's what the
regulators have done that.
regulations are for. That's right. At this point, if the C-suite doesn't understand that they have to do that, you can effectively put the regulation in front of them that says, look, you're responsible for signing off on this. So if you don't sign off on it, they're going to come talk to you, not me. I think that's pretty a foregone conclusion at this point. And whether the C-suite likes it or not, unfortunately, it's, the regulations have squarely placed the responsibility with them.
Yep. I think another selling point that kind of softens that blow is C-suite doesn't necessarily have to dedicate a full day